So today's webinar is entitled Launch Excellence is Dead. Hopefully not. Long live Launch Excellence. Presented by Fraction Partner Avi Leaf. Avi will provide an assessment on how far Launch Excellence really progressed over the last 20 years. And some of the increased complexities I think we're all aware of now when launching a new brand. Avi's really well placed to give his view on this. He's had 24 years experience of bringing teams together, focusing on building, executing launch plans to achieve successful launches. He's been working at a broad range of top pharma and biotech companies across many therapy areas. And therefore, obviously, if you have any questions, then please feel free to ask them at the end. But we'll let Avi I'll hand over now, Avi, and just let you obviously take people through the webinar.
Brilliant. Thanks, Mike. And thank you all for joining. I appreciate it on what in many places is quite a hot day, here in London included. So as Mike said, I'm Avi Leaf, and I've been working in the industry over 24 years. A lot of my time spent leading brands at a local, European and global level. And just wanted to talk a little bit today about the evolution of launch excellence over the years. So let's start with a story. Everyone likes a good story, eh? So this story is really a tale of two emissions, if you like. Not emissions, but omissions. The background, it was the early 2000s. I was working in a top 10 global pharma company, and I was part of the new product planning team, and I was representing the European voice from a commercial perspective. So the team in the room at the time for this big meeting that was taking place was about 20 to 25 US-based colleagues and 2 EU-based colleagues, of which I was one representing commercial and my colleague representing medical. We were discussing phase 3 development and planning. So it was really at that stage gate, having completed phase 2. And in the room, there were people from commercial, from medical, development, and regulatory. So I guess the key thing here is there were 2 glaring emissions. I mean, I'm sure there were others, but 2 really struck out for me at the time. And this is 15 years ago or so. One, no market access representation. So that was, for me, a bit of a shock, and something I went back to and discussed in the meeting, but also after the meeting. The other one was there was no discussion on evidence generation post phase 3. So if you like, we were preparing for launch, and from a forecasting perspective, there was this big gap in between launch and loss of exclusivity. So there was no real plans to generate additional studies, additional evidence up until loss of exclusivity. So it was get to launch, hit that milestone, and that was it. So that was quite an interesting situation. And I bring this up because I think it's important to see how far we've come in the last 10, 15 years. And certainly this was, as I say, new product planning, preparing for phase 3. So really in that sweet spot of launch excellence, or where launch excellence really sits now. So the last thing to say, I guess, from that little story was there was still launch elements in place. So there was a lot of key opinion leader and HCP engagement with healthcare professionals. There was a very robust launch plan in place, covering across elements of marketing, medical, regulatory development, and eventually, to an extent, market access, of course. And if you like, there were strong elements of prepare the company, prepare the market, and prepare the brand, which I'll come back to in a moment. So that was the situation then. So it's interesting to think about what is launch excellence in pharmaceutical terms. And there are many different variations on a theme, but it's really around the state an organization achieves around all components, reinforcing launch success, being well aligned. Of course, you've got to execute upon them, make sure the outcomes are clearly defined and shared between relevant internal and external stakeholders. The main aim of launch, of course, is to ensure ultimately patients gain access to the latest innovations in medicine, making sure that ultimately they're improving the quality of life and health outcomes for these patients. And of course, getting these medicines and innovations to patients as quickly as possible, safely, is absolutely critical. All the while, of course, want to ensure that pharmaceutical companies are generating strong return for their investment, ultimately so that they can continue to innovate by reinvesting any of that money and profit that they do make, or that return that they do make. Otherwise, they're going to be going bankrupt very quickly. So there are numerous different ways to approach launch excellence. One I mentioned briefly: prepare the company, prepare the market, prepare the brand. So if you think about that, there's three big buckets there. Preparing the company involves elements, of course, around training, making sure you've got the right teams in place at the right time, making sure you've got organizational alignment, supply chain fits in there. Preparing the market is a lot around medical education and ensuring that the product is getting, or the market is ready for the product to enter, that the unmet need is clearly defined and market research is conducted. And then, of course, preparing the brand. A lot of branding elements will be fitting into this bucket, making sure that you've got all the right branding elements in place, conducted the research that support the brand proposition, and all the elements that go together with branding. Other people have talked in the past about the 4 Ps: promotion, place, product, price. I've seen people talk about 7 Ps, which includes the process, physical evidence, people as well is very important. Of course, a lot of focus on people, much more so these days. I've even seen people talk about 10 Ps, and I'm not going to rattle off the 10 Ps now, because I probably won't be able to remember 1 or 2 of them off the top of my head. But suffice to say, whichever way companies and teams are preparing for launch in pharmaceuticals, I think it's clear to say that having the right elements in the right order, have connected team thinking, have an insight-driven strategy with clear planning and strong engagement, all of that needs to be put together in the right place, in the right order, in the right time. And that's absolutely critical for getting the best chance of a successful launch. So I also wanted to talk about the impact of COVID-19 pandemic, because this is a real inflection point, if you like, not only in pharmaceuticals, of course, but in pretty much every area and every walk of life that we can think about. But from a pharmaceutical perspective, prior to the pandemic, the launch environment in pharmaceuticals was already increasingly challenging, as we all know. But if you think about pre-COVID from a therapeutic area perspective, there were more primary care launches: cardiovascular, diabetes as good examples, asthma previously as another one. If you think about the engagement model, quite often I remember this from various products I worked on, but I'm sure many of us can think back to those huge sales forces really just trying to get a larger share of voice than the competitor, and just knocking on every single door multiple times for physician engagement. And of course, from an evidence perspective, randomized controlled trials are absolutely critical, but not continuous LCM, as I gave an example of in my story a few slides back. But what happened after COVID and in the last couple of years, and this was moving that way already for sure, but certainly even more so now in the last couple of years, a greater emphasis on specialty care, on oncology, rare disease, autoimmune. In terms of engagement model, it's moved away from just Salesforce and noise to much more an omni-channel engagement perspective. So from an omni-channel perspective, it's really making sure you've got the right message to the right customer through the right channel at the right time. And that's absolutely critical to make sure that that's all joined up. Otherwise, you've got maybe a multi-channel approach, but certainly not omni-channel. And from an evidence perspective, it's more integrated, continuous lifecycle management, and Keytruda is a very good example, recent example of how that's been done to an excellent level. And of course, patient-generated outcomes and patient-generated data is much more the norm these days, and looking at patient-reported outcomes is much more critical these days as well. So with that as a backdrop, I think the other thing to be aware of is that the healthcare systems are increasingly stressed. They've got tighter budgets. And of course, from an engagement perspective, there is more remote engagement taking place, whether it's remote access through Salesforce, but as I mentioned, from an omni-channel perspective, more focus on a more rounded channel approach to physician and healthcare professional engagement. So what are the launch excellence fundamentals now? I'll touch on a couple of things. The first is make sure you have a clear strategy based on deep insights. And when I talk about insights, it's really an actionable insight that comes from market research, engagement with patients and physicians or patient groups. And a lot of people talk about insights as though they exist everywhere, but actually getting a true insight that's actionable for a full strategy to develop is pretty challenging. So really making sure you've got deep insights to frame your strategy around and help differentiate from the competition, if there is competition, is critical. So in other words, really know where to play and how to win. Secondly, having full launch plans and tactics that go alongside that with relevant metrics and key performance indicators is really absolutely critical as well. Having a commercial go-to-market model, especially for each of the markets where they have nuanced differences. How many people on the ground do they need? What type of approach are they going to take? Where they can have integrated approaches as well is also very important. And of course, having strong organizational engagement and organizational alignment and belief in the launch and the launch planning and preparation is absolutely key as well. So that really needs also to have a strong culture of learning and executional excellence. In other words, everyone in the organization, whatever their function, needs to be aligned and pointing in the same direction and strongly behind that launch. So what do pharma companies do now as best practice? Of course, they have launch excellence teams, and that will inevitably involve pricing and market access much earlier on, and many times now they're involved even phase 2 for sure, and also involving country team members earlier is very important to get those nuanced differences and understand different go-to-market approaches is very key. Launch playbooks. A lot of pharma companies are creating their own or developing their own launch playbooks, which is really helping them get a better understanding of where to play and how to win, and being able to provide that out to all of the market team members as well. The launch roadmap, as I mentioned before, is absolutely key and a really good early starting point to ensure that planning takes place much earlier. And with that launch roadmap, of course, having a good understanding, not only across all of the different functions, what are they doing between, let's say, phase 2 or phase 1 or phase 3, whatever it may be, and launch and beyond launch, but also, of course, to make sure that a critical path is mapped out. And lastly, regular country launch readiness assessments. So not only engaging with countries early and getting them activated and on board and having a good understanding of the product that is coming through this launch process, but having regular connections with the market teams is absolutely critical. And at the very least, on top of regulatory and development, you want to be having regular interactions with what I call 3M, so marketing, medical, and market access at the very least. And of course, as you get closer to launch, the sales team and the other elements that you have in your core launch team are going to be important as well. So some teams at the local level also have an omni-channel expert or a digital expert. So where's it likely to go into the future? Well, take a crystal ball and take your pick. But certainly what we do know is that there are higher hurdles for demonstrating benefit from a regulatory perspective as much as from a payer perspective. So developing a deep understanding of local healthcare systems, care pathways, and other priorities at a global, but also, of course, regional and certainly local level is going to be very important, and having a good understanding of that earlier is going to ensure that you have a better chance of being able to have some co-creation activities or working together hand in hand at various points. According to IQVIA, I found this fascinating. 85% of internationally excellent launches are concentrated in 3 specialty areas: oncology, HIV, and immunology. Now, of course, this doesn't take into account most recent launches, and certainly you could take the diabetes/obesity products as one of those outliers, which I'm sure many of you, if not all of you on the call, have seen in the news pretty much every day at the moment. And aside from that, I think the trend is still, certainly has been up to this point, concentrated on specialty, rare, and oncology. And the likelihood for success is certainly increased by a company focusing on a few core therapy areas. I think that's been ably demonstrated over the years. Having early and targeted engagement is critical, and I think even more critical now is the role that the medical team, whether it's the medical team as they start or as they expand with MSLs in the field, having that early and targeted engagement and ongoing engagement is going to be critical. And of course, I mentioned it in terms of omnichannel engagements, greater remote activities, having a better understanding of physician and healthcare professional personas is going to be really key, and certainly that's being used a lot by many pharma companies and biotechs these days already, is understanding the different physician types that are in that particular therapy area, understanding their pains and gains, and being able to address those with appropriate messages through the right channel at the right time is going to be really key as well. So I guess in summary, an early focused setup and having the right planning are certainly key to a great launch. Does that mean that you're going to be successful every time? Not necessarily. Of course, there's many other factors that come into play, and nuance factors at that, in every single situation where you find yourself in a launch preparation. But these are certainly some of them. And of course, if you think about 2 key areas around launch preparation and team structure, getting those right first are probably 2 very, very important areas to ensure that you nail before moving on to some other nuanced areas. So setting guidelines and team charter is really important right at the start, so people have that North Star, if you like. Mapping out a clear launch roadmap or clear launch plan, as I said, with that critical path is very important. Having clear, actionable key performance indicators, not only pre-launch, peri-launch, but of course post-launch as well. So, and those KPIs will change as you move from pre-launch to post-launch. From a team structure perspective, having people in the team who've already got launch expertise is always going to be useful. They can draw on that previous experience, take some of those lessons learned and information that they've gleaned from previous launches, and utilize that to avoid some pitfalls and challenges on a new launch. Having clear roles and expectations for the team is critical as well. And as I mentioned, lesson learned is important, and also regular feedback, not only individually but across the team, and having checkpoints throughout. Regular checkpoints is critical. So I'll leave it there for the time being. As I say, I've just touched on this area, but whether you feel like therefore the sun is setting on launch excellence in pharmaceuticals, or whether actually the sun is rising and there's lots more to come, is really up to you. But I'll leave it there and say thank you very much. And if you have any questions, happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Avi. Thank you. Well, the sun is certainly out, but it is where I am anyway, at 30-degree heat. Thank you. And a lot of what you presented really resonated, because I mean, I've been in the industry for nearly 30 years, and launch excellence has certainly changed. And in that time, I've launched about 3 brands, and I have to say, on all occasions, they've pretty much been thrown over the fence too late. And then you're scrambling around and you're trying to prepare the market and everything else. So do you think companies are really starting to clock onto that now? Do you really think it's changing?
Yeah, I mean, it does depend, obviously, from company to company, from biotech to biotech, and also depends on what situation they find themselves in. So it still happens quite often that pharmaceutical companies, big pharma, will bring in a late stage product, and that product may already be some way into phase 3. So if that's the case, then they're in the same situation where they're playing catch up. So even if they get some good information from the company that they've brought in the product from, they may certainly have to take a bit of time to get up to speed, which of course is eating into their time towards launch. But quite often, if it's brought in from a biotech, there'll be certain things that will be absolutely well documented, but there may be other things that aren't necessarily fully fleshed out yet. So as I say, it really depends. But yes, in general, people are moving towards that direction, as you mentioned, and as I mentioned previously, that they're trying to do things as early as they can, and certainly earlier than it has been 12, 15 years ago.
Yeah, fabulous. Okay, great. Avi, could you stop sharing actually, because I'd just like to open the discussion up to the wider panel.
Yeah.
Hi, everyone. Steve, over to you. You've got a question.
Hi, yes, thank you. Thank you for your presentation. I really enjoyed it.
Pleasure.
My question was around, you quite correctly highlighted the move to specialization post pandemic. And I was just wondering if you had any thoughts about what people could do if they're not in one of those specialties, if they're not an oncology product or not an HIV product. Have you got any thoughts or ideas about what that would look like for somebody?
Do you mean, thanks for the question, Steve. Just to clarify, do you mean if you're working on a product for launch, but it's not in a specialty or oncology area?
Yes, exactly. Sorry, I didn't explain it very well. Sorry.
No, I mean, look, there's still plenty of products that are in therapy areas that are not rare and not oncology and not specialty. It's just that that's where the industry has moved to, as they're trying to find new areas where they can really demonstrate a strong unmet need. So there may be certain other areas that are less than or not specialty, as you were talking about. If you've got areas of unmet need that you can uncover and talk through, then that's going to be really important. The reason that, or one of the reasons why the industry has been moving across towards specialty and oncology and rare is certainly, at least in part, because many of the bigger therapy areas, so I mentioned asthma, for example, I mentioned cardiovascular and diabetes, they've been well served over the last 20, 30 years. And certainly I've worked in those three areas previously. When I started over 24 years ago, there weren't that many products in hypertension, for example, but very quickly there were 10, 12 products on the market. Same with type 2 diabetes. So the more products that come into that particular therapy area, the harder and harder it is to show a strong clinical unmet need versus what's already out in the market. And then, of course, that is going to be challenging to demonstrate that, but also from a pricing and market access perspective, those hurdles then become higher, and that makes it much more challenging.
Yeah.
Super, thank you.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I've got a couple, Mike.
Hey.
I appreciate the overview. Couple of just questions, and maybe others have thoughts on this as well. The first one's a simple kind of terminology question. You use the term launch plan, launch playbook, launch roadmap. I find myself sometimes in a terminology gap. I think sometimes I think the core launch plan is that operational, task-oriented, milestone-driven, buy-win, critical path kind of document. And then you've got the strategic, document that is capturing, like you say, the where to play, how to win. Sometimes I see terminology differences on how people are using it. It's just kind of a simple general question. I'd be curious how you might differentiate those. And then I'd also be curious, I was in an organization that had an internal launch excellence group, And I'm kind of curious whether that is still the organizational path forward, or, as we think about some of the things we support, are those really being effective, or are people going externally for some of the launch excellence support? So just be curious on your thoughts.
Sure. Thanks, Tom. Yeah, great questions. Second question first. Are people going externally? Yes, they certainly are. But at the same time, there's more and more pharma companies certainly that are trying to bring it in-house. So you mentioned a launch excellence team. There's more and more launch excellence teams that are springing up in-house in quite a number of pharma companies. So they might have started externally. They might still have a launch excellence team in-house, but use some consultant support to help them generate what they need from a launch excellence perspective. Ultimately, what they're trying to do, of course, is make sure that they've got all of that knowledge in-house, as pharma companies will want to do. And that's the same in any functional area, of course. And they're trying to build up that launch expertise to make sure that once they've done one or a number of launches, depending on the size of the organization and their pipeline, etc., they want to make sure that they take those launch learnings and then be able to apply those to future launches, so that ultimately all of that knowledge stays in-house, regardless of whether people move around. So that, I guess that's my answer to the first question is, yes, they're trying to bring more of it in-house, but there'll always be development in the area of launch excellence, which I'm sure will mean that, that there'll still be a need for external support from time to time. In terms of your question around terminology, and I guess when you're asking, there's different variations on a theme or different terms for what may be seen as the same thing in terms of launch playbook and things like that. Yeah, and launch roadmap or launch plan. Yeah, sometimes they are seen as the same thing or pretty much the same, but certainly from company to company, as you know as well as I do, then different companies will have slightly different take on what is a launch plan versus what is a launch playbook, and various other terms that they may use within their launch excellence team and through the organization. But I was just wondering, I guess a question back to you is, why is it that you're questioning what the difference is between the different terminology, or what's the challenge that you're having? Is it
so I have been in discussions that when I use the term launch plan, it has meant different things to different people. And so I'm trying to sort out the clarity and the rigor of that very operational, task-oriented, who does what by when, milestone risks, all those kinds of things. And I find less people thinking about that, and differentiating that from a launch plan that is a strategic plan forward. Here is where we're going to play, here's how we're going to win. I just find myself in terminology differences. So, I was just kind of curious, and it may, to your point, just simply vary company to company. But it's been interesting, I think, just a little bit for me to see those differences.
Well, fair enough. And I'd say actually that just also reminds me about one of the things I said earlier on in the talk, was that it's really important that when you set up a launch team at the start, you do have the right people in the room cross-functionally. You talk through the objectives of the team, how often you're going to meet, talk through a project charter, and within that you'll have a discussion on certain types of terminology and different phrases that you're all going to use, and then that sets the scene for everything else going forward. So if you talk about a launch plan, does that mean a strategic brand plan or strategic launch plan, or does that mean actually the plan that you map out, let's say in a brown paper exercise between now and launch over the next couple of years, which is much more functional? What are the key activities that need to take place? And then you build from there. So I think that's really important, and it just highlights, as you say, that having that cross-functional team discussion at the start is really important.
Yeah, really good question, Tom. Thank you. Paul, you have a question, have your hand up. Hi.
Yeah, thanks, Mike, and thanks, Avi. Very interesting. Sorry, I was a few minutes late joining, so I might have missed a bit. The question, I'm UK based, and so my market access is mainly with UK based organisations or UK affiliates. What would you say is the kind of biggest gaps in capability or knowledge that organisations launching have in the UK, at least?
Oh, that's a good question. It probably would depend from company to company, to be honest. Certainly, as you say, you're coming from an access perspective. Probably one area, and I mentioned it before, is really having a good understanding of the healthcare system, and the interactions that could take place, the areas of possible co-working or co-creation, and ways ultimately that a pharma company can help that system or help move things quicker or find better ways to do things. It's probably one area that I've seen some companies do pretty well. They have a whole team working on that sort of area. So not just looking at market access in terms of, for example, you talked about UK NICE or SMC, for example, but really a whole team looking at a local level, at a regional, not only at the UK, then looking at England versus Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and then within that, looking at a regional level, then looking at the local level, what are the nuanced differences, and how can the company be of help, of use, and of support, and act as a partner, working together to try and improve the system. I think that's probably one area that I've seen some companies do really well, and I'll cite Novartis as an example where I've seen that done well, and other companies that are not necessarily quite there yet.
Which you won't know.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Paul. Does that answer your question, Paul?
Yeah, I mean, I used to work for Wilmington, so we were UK specialists, and we were always saying you need to understand the market.
Yeah.
And I think global don't necessarily demand that of all their affiliates, and the UK always says they're different, don't they? So
yeah, absolutely. Of which we are, of course.
yeah, that's true.
Harris, sorry, Jeff, before I come on to you, Harris, I noticed you had your hand up. I didn't know if you wanted to ask a question. No? Okay, I'll move on to Jeff then. Jeff, hi.
Yeah, hi, and thanks, Avi, for this presentation. Really aligned with what you presented, and really resonated with me as well. One observation, and it's sort of related to Paul's question just now, is when we talk about understanding the market and generating insights, I think where I've seen it done well or not so well is, either it's a checkbox exercise where you have in your plan that you need to generate X, Y, or Z insights, but then not translating this into a strategic imperative for the brand, and what does it mean for the brand strategy. So I think that's really critical. I think you said it very well. It's really not just generating insight for the sake of having insights, but really what it means for the strategy is really critical. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. And I totally agree. It's as I say, getting a true insight that's actionable for a team to really action against strategically and then tactically is quite difficult. But through rounds of market research and doing the right research, asking the right questions, and of course having a lot of engagement early on with physicians, healthcare professionals, and patient groups is absolutely critical as well. And then mapping out the patient journey. So I haven't talked about all of the elements within, of course, launch excellence, but mapping out the patient journey and really understanding what does the patient go through from start to finish. And what are the stages in between? How long does that take? Where do they get lost in the system? Where can things be sped up? Where are their pain points? And then as a result, what are some of those leverage points that we can look at and action against to help strategically and then tactically really drive what we're trying to do to improve things ultimately for the patient who's involved.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jeff. Paul, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, it was thinking about nuancing messages for local markets, and particularly, say in the UK, we've got a lot of different sort of payers within that kind of overall bracket. So, and I may have talked about this before I joined the call. To what extent in the pre-launch plan should we be looking at value proposition development for that kind of multiplicity of players that will either make or break the market access? And how important is it to kind of look at that multi-dimensional value proposition development at that pre-launch stage? Because certainly post-launch you've got to do it. That's what reps would do, isn't it? They, without marketing having done it, they already sort of do that naturally. So to what extent do we need to do that sort of in a purposeful way, and at what stage?
Yeah, well, quite often companies will actually, or the access team, market access team and HEOR team will be working on a value proposition, whether it comes from the global team and then given to a local team to adapt locally, or work in conjunction and co-create with the local teams. That normally takes place through phase 3. So certainly once you've got your pivotal phase 3 results, or I mean, if you're talking about rare, you may not even get to that point. But when you get some critical and pivotal results that allow you effectively to go towards filing, that's usually a place where that market access team will really develop the value proposition, and that will then also be something in terms of if they take it into market research, testing core value messages, which may be very well and should be very well aligned with the core brand messages, of course. But of course, one of the things that you mentioned is from the value perspective, that's going to be really important from that team. So yeah, as I say, normally certainly prior to launch, as you get towards filing, it's around that sort of time where you should normally have for your product enough information to create that value proposition, the value messages, and be able to tack onto that, of course, other things like the budget impact model and various other things, mixed treatment analysis, or all of those that feed into that overall value for the product.
Just chiming into that discussion, and this is an opinion only, so this is not in fact anyone is welcome to disagree. I always wanted positioning in place before value proposition. What I had experiences where a market access team would get ahead on a value prop, and then we'd end up with a little bit of a disconnect on the brand positioning. So I always thought of it, and again, it was just an opinion, that I like to anchor to the positioning, and then right out of positioning, the value messages, all those kinds of things, the scientific stuff, then led right into the value prop. That's the way I thought about it. So from a timing perspective, to me, I always ran it just right after positioning. So.
Yeah, it makes sense. I don't think there's necessarily a right or wrong answer. As I say, it depends totally on the situation for that particular product. But yeah, I mean, positioning would normally come earlier on anyway in that process, in that launch planning process. As much information as you have, and then of course, once you're really settling on a positioning statement and a positioning document, if you like, then you might want to take that through market research, of course, and test a number of different positioning options, positioning statements, to see which one or ones resonate most strongly with that physician group or healthcare professionals. And then, yeah, sometime after that, depending on the product situation, would come the development or stronger development of the value messages, the value proposition, and some of the market access and HEOR activities.
Yeah, excellent. Any other questions? Just to add, Avi, how's the current climate, I guess, affecting launch excellence now? Because we're in a phase now where costs are increasing, pricing's getting squeezed, and things are getting a bit tougher out there. So just wondering how that's affecting maybe how some of the companies think about launch excellence and how they're approaching the markets now.
Yeah, great question, Mike. I think it's quite variable, to be honest. As I was saying earlier, if you've got an organization who's fully behind the process of launch excellence and really understanding the need to do it right, do it correctly, and do it in a timely manner, then hopefully that's not one area that gets squeezed too much, if at all, because we all know, and this is still pretty much the case worldwide across all products, is the first 6 months of a product launch are critical in terms of determining its overall launch trajectory and where it tops out. So we don't get launch right, you've got a very, very difficult chance, or a very slim chance, I should say, of actually correcting for that. It has been done, and there are certainly case studies that have shown that, but it's pretty challenging. So from that perspective, do companies squeeze? Yes, they do. Every company will squeeze wherever they can if they're in that situation where they need to cut down on costs. But hopefully that's not an area that gets cut down too much in comparison with some other areas.
Yeah, agreed. Excellent. Okay. Any other questions before we finish up?
Hi, Mike. It's Phil here.
Hi, Phil.
Time for one more?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, go ahead.
Avi, thanks for the presentation. I guess one of the things I was thinking about is thinking about value propositions and so on. Have you ever seen, you have the experience of companies actually designing their phase 3 around a value proposition?
I haven't seen it per se. Have you got an example that you're thinking about?
Yeah, I can think of 2 or 3 where actually bringing the payers in as part of the design of the phase 3 helps to build a value proposition and the positioning statement, and then the rest of it cascades from there. And then you end up with, hopefully, aiming to at least produce data that meets the payer's needs before you get to the kind of how do we make the data fit stage.
Yeah, and it's a good point. It's certainly something from that perspective that I have seen. So maybe I misunderstood slightly what you were asking, but yeah, it's certainly and that's what I was saying before, the earlier that you can have engagement with all levels and all different types of healthcare professionals, not just physicians, is absolutely critical. And that's why when I started with that story 12, 15 years ago, whenever it was, not having someone from pricing and market access in the room for a critical stage gate discussion on moving to phase 3 and what the studies would look like was in my mind absolutely critical mistake. And I fought, actually, in that particular scenario, I fought for months to get someone to just to be able to join that particular team so they could be part of the discussions, as opposed to me relaying everything from backwards from them and back again. But yeah, it totally makes sense.
Yeah, I think because it's so hard to retrofit data sometimes to what people think the payers want based on.
Exactly.
So I think for me, it's a critical thing to have payers involved in the design of phase 3, because then that aids everything else further down the track and gets you through the gate.
Yeah,
agree. And in the same way, people are doing the same with patient groups much earlier on as well.
Yeah, and patient groups being involved in some of the regulatory work as well.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, really good question. I'm a bit jealous, Phil. It's been a while since I've launched a brand, but never had that. You got payers in a phase 3. I think that's
I think these days it's a must-have if it's at all possible. Anyway.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, excellent. Avi, thank you.